We set out in August 1914, a small Carpathian survey party carrying a plane table, theodolite, and a prismatic compass, 4 hounds supplied by a local forester, and rations packed on mules. We had come to mark passes for the maps of an empire at war, but the villagers' quiet warnings about dogs disappearing along the ridges gave the work a new, ominous purpose. I led a 3-man surveying detail, myself, Petre and Andrei, accompanied by Matei, a guide born to the lower slopes, and the forester Ionescu, who insisted upon coming as far as the timberline to see his hounds returned. We left the last hamlet at dawn, 3 mules laden with sacks of hardtack and salted pork, a spare theodolite case, lengths of chain and canvas, a roll of duck canvas tents, and the small black cylinder of aneroid barometer which I kept closest to my chest. The plane table travelled strapped to a frame. Its alidade gleamed when the sun found it. My brass prismatic compass I wore against my breast beneath my coat. Wartime maps, crude and scrawled with new troop lines, lay folded under my greatcoat, their edges softened by use and damp. The ascent began on a cart track that soon became nothing more than hoof-slick soil and stepping stones. The air smelled of pine resin and a sour undertone of livestock where the slopes steepened. The wind took on the metallic bite of coming rain. We travelled slow, surveying at walk, to keep the plane table steady when set, to measure with the theodolite in calm, and to read the barometer for each new saddle. Petre handled the plane table. He was small and precise, and spoke little, his hands already stained by grease and ink. Andrei took notes in a notebook bound in oilskin, and called distances to me. By estimation, he kept a stub of pencil tight between his soles, like an incantation. Matei kept the mules in line, sang to them softly at difficult crossings. Ionescu walked with the hounds reined close, 4 lean animals, short-haired, grey-mottled, with flanks like guitar backs, and eyes that tracked the trees as if reading a script adults had forgotten. When they sniffed at a root or a hollow, they did so with a patience beyond hunger. The villagers had not pressed their warnings in the market manner of superstition. They spoke in whispers, at the wells or by the oven, as one would speak of fever or a neighbour's failing. "Do not trust the ridge at moonrise," an old woman told Matei as she handed him a loaf. I remember his face then, tight, not for my benefit, but for the sound of what he had learned in his valley. They spoke of hounds that left the leash and followed something unseen, of collars found empty at dawn, of tracks that led to the breeding rocks, and then simply ceased. I had written their words into my oilskin journal with the same mechanical hand with which I took bearings, as if recording the fact was somehow to staple it to the world. By the second evening, we camped on a narrow saddle with the sky boiling to the west. The tents were pegged into sod, and the kerosene lamps were trimmed. The mules were hobbled and fed. We took turns with the instruments, a quick setup of the plane table to fix the pass, a few azimuths with the theodolite, the barometer checked and read aloud in the dusk. I remember the fine, persistent noise of the stream below, and the distant swell of thunder like a drum for a regiment that would not yet arrive. The hounds grew restless at the first dim. They paced the outer cord of the camp, noses to the wind, their bodies low and taut. Ionescu would calm them with a stone thrown past their heads, and then they would freeze, ears pinning forward, and one of them, an old bitch with a white snip, gave a low, prolonged note, not a bark, but a call from the throat, and fixed her eyes on the ridgeline. We leaned toward her gaze. The ridge showed only a black smudge of pines against the failing light. There was the small, ordinary smell of cooking stew and wet canvas and lamp oil. There was the metallic smell of the instruments in their cases. Beyond that, the night held a stillness that seemed to listen. I logged the bearing, the barometric reading, the height, and then paused because the scrabble of something on the far slope sounded like cloth or feet. Petre looked up from his plane table as if a gust had shifted the alidad. André closed his notebook with a soft, quick motion. Matej set his hand on his knife. I remember more than the sound, the way the hound's muscles showed beneath their skin, the way their eyes filled with something that was not simple fear. We had come to mark passes for an empire at war. We had not expected to be kept watch by dogs at a saddle in the dark, nor to measure the space between ordinary light and whatever moved in the tree line. We slept in turns that night, armed with a theodolite and an old man's promises, and with the knowledge that at dawn we would climb higher. The southern Carpathian slopes were sodden with mist. Spruce creaked beneath a wet wind, and morning clouds sat like a lid over the hollows. The cold had a metallic tang on the tongue that morning, and every leather strap of our kit took on the feeling of age. I had with me 2 hounds, Gelu, a brindled shepherd of no small courage, and Lupa, smaller, keen-eared, kept for scenting and for the quiet comfort of habit. My party consisted of Dr. Emil Kovac, who carried the planetable and aneroid barometer, my assistant Jan with the folding camera and notebooks, and 2 Vlach guides, Petru and Niku, with 6 porters to shoulder our tins and rope. We bore a theodolite in its brass case, Mauser rifles packed with extra clips, a spool of hempen rope, oilskins, wool blankets, spare hobnailed boots, tins of preserved beef and coffee, and a small medicine chest whose bandages Petru checked with a grim, practiced hand. Villagers from the hamlet had told us, half in jest and half in dread, of dogs that went out at dusk and were never seen again. The priest crossed. Himself, when I mentioned our hounds, and an old woman pressed a charm of braided garlic into Petru's palm as if it were coin. We laughed among ourselves then, the sort of laughter one affords to superstition while tightening bootlaces and repacking cartridges. At noon, the mist thinned, and our planetable took bearings, the aneroid read higher than expected. We pinned a new line on the sheet and set off up the southern ridge, the spruce needles shedding rain in whispers. The first sign that something was amiss came at dusk. Gelu had gone ahead, as was his wont, nose to the loam, tail a semaphore. Lupa patrolled my heels. They ran together toward a narrow ravine where the undergrowth swallowed light. We called them. Jan whistled, Petru stamped, and used a low, urgent command in the Vlach tongue. At the far lip of the ravine, Gelu answered with a single, bright bay, and then silence, as though a cord had been drawn tight across the air. Lupa dropped her ears and whined once. We pushed into the thorn and bilberry. The forest changed. The wind died away, and the spruce trunks pressed in with a throat-like closeness. Underfoot were prints, Gelu's heavy pads, Lupa's smaller tracks, and then other marks, a jagged tearing of leaf and bark, as if some large body had forced the brush aside, and a strip of disturbed soil where a burden had been dragged. The Mauser at my shoulder felt heavier. For an hour we searched by lantern and by the poor light of a moon that struggled behind cloud. We found a collar, the leather cut clean and chewed, its brass nameplate bent, Gelu. We found tufts of hair, not torn but singed at the tips, with a copper tang to the fingers when we drew them into the oilskin of my glove. There was no blood in quantity, only a smear, as if something had brushed past and shaken off. Most disturbing of all were the tracks. Besides our hounds' marks, there were no hoof or human prints that might explain a butcher at work. Only impressions not wholly like any paw or print I had seen before, elongated digits pressed deep and then vanishing at the edge of a pool of black water. That night, we sat in a ring around a tin lamp, the theodolite case serving as our table. Petru ground coffee with his hands and told us, in the fragments of his speech that were not simply superstition, of lights that walked on the far slopes, and a cry that came like wood struck by a human throat, and then by something else. Dr. Kovac tried to set a barometer reading and muttered about an atmospheric disturbance. Jan examined the photographs he had taken earlier and found one plate fogged by a mist that had not been there when he exposed it. We checked our rifles and counted cartridges 3 times. The men spoke, but without hope in their voices. Lupa would not lie still. She nosed at the forest edge and emitted a low, questioning whine that caused every hair at the nape of my neck to lift. At 2 in the morning, a sound rose from the ravine. Not the bay of a hound, but a long, slow noise. A flute of notes that fell and rose like the bending of a reed. It carried no immediate threat in tone, yet the air after it tasted of something burnt and old. Petru spat and crossed himself. Niku whispered that the thing often came at dusk to take what the hills had promised. We formed a watch, 4 hours each, the Mausers across our knees, our breaths tight inside wool collars. I took the first watch and sat with Galus collar in my palm, feeling the cold on the brass and the damp of the leather. I measured the slope with my eye, set the planetable beside me, and waited. When dawn came, the ravine was empty, save for that bent plate and the crushed foliage. There was no trail to follow beyond a thin ridge of mist. We ate in silence, loaded the rifles, and agreed to press higher along the contour at daybreak. The priest's benediction had not felt absurd to any of us that morning. We moved forward, instruments at the ready, boots sinking in wet moss, and I could not rid myself of the impression that every tree watched with the patience of something that waits for the reckoning of men. We were 5 in the field that afternoon. Myself with the theodolite and map case, Janos holding the chain and field book, Petre with his carbine and the 2 hounds, and the younger lads tasked with carrying the tents, the plate camera and the tins. Our kit was what any survey party in these mountains would carry in 1914. Brass theodolite on its tripod, a prismatic compass, measuring chain and leveling staff, a box camera with a handful of dry plates wrapped in oilcloth, spare pencils, tins of pemmican and tea, a kerosene lamp and spare wicks, hemp rope, a feed of cartridges, and an iron wedge for crude markers. Rain had fallen the night before our canvas felt damp when we struck camp. The air carried that metallic, wet smell of upland earth. We pressed along the juniper line beneath a low, iron-streaked crag that rose like a rusted tooth from the hillside. It was there, in a narrow glade where the soil was churned and damp, that the evidence first refused to be dismissed. The prints lay shallow, impressed into the loam as if by weight rather than sharp claws. They were larger than the pads of a shepherd's dog I had known as a boy, yet the spacing of the steps did not match the long gait of a wolf. Janos knelt, careful not to disturb the impression, and set his palm beside one of them. He looked up at me without a word. I knew he saw the same thing I did. A harness lay rent across a fallen juniper bough, its leather split clean as though a sudden strain had taken it. The stitching hung in ragged threads. Petre stooped, fingers steady in spite of the stiffness of the morning, and drew a tuft of coarse grey hair from the branch, coarser than any canine undercoat I had handled, longer and wirier, the guard hairs threaded with a dark tip. I wrapped the sample in oilcloth and slipped it into my notebook, noting the bearing and depth. We photographed the harness and the prints with the box camera. The exposure took time, and the lads held the plates muffled against the wind. All the while, the instruments misbehaved. As we moved nearer the ferruginous outcrop, the compass needle wavered, lagging and twitching before it settled, as if some local influence tugged at it. I put the theodolite on its tripod and took a sight to the far ridge as routine when I ran the check against a landmark we had fixed an hour before. The reading hung a fraction of a degree off. Not much on paper, but enough to trouble a surveyor. Small errors propagate, and here the error followed our footsteps like a shadow. I unscrewed the sighting lens, cleared it of grit, tightened the bearings of the instrument, and yet the discrepancy remained. Petre ran a hand over his iron butt unconsciously, listening. The hounds, Saws and Lada, were the first to betray whatever it was that had passed through. Both trembled so as to lift the hackles on their necks. Saws nosed at the prince, then backed away with a low whine and stalked to the fringe of the trees, ears pricked and body rigid. They returned repeatedly to the tree line, standing with muzzle to the wood, and listening as if a voice unseen spoke from within. Their restlessness infected us. Janos thumbed his pencil and could not steady the line of his notes. The younger lad kept glancing over the bared roots and shadows. We found other things. Snap fasteners from a dog's harness, flattened as if by a tremendous blow, and the smear of an oily substance on a rock face that took light differently from the surrounding stone. When the wind shifted, it carried a low exhalation, not the nasal scent of wolves, nor the musk of boar, but a cold iron note that made my eyes water. The sky had closed in with a bank of cloud, and the light turned hard and grey. A rain was promised that evening, and with it less light for photography and fewer safe hours to carry out a careful triangulation. My fingers grew numb. Despite gloves, I pocketed the camera plates, marked our bearings as best I could, and ordered we make a temporary camp where the slope fell gentler. We set 2 watches. The lads made a small shelter of canvas and cut a stout pole to brace the theodolite should the tripod slip. Petre set the hounds to the tent flap and kept his carbine near. I wrote the day's notes with a hand that would not settle and recorded plainly the prints, the torn harness, the tufts of grey. The ferruginous outcrop cast a long, shadowed silhouette as evening gathered, and the compass needle spun once more like an idle wheel. Before the lamps were trimmed, the hounds rose and gave a single thin cry from the edge of the trees. No full howl, no clear animal call, but a sound of attention. Something moved among the juniper and twigged branches snapped in a deliberate, slow rhythm. We stiffened, instruments forgotten for the moment, as men will when calculation yields to what is immediate and living. Petre stepped forward, rifle leveled, and I lifted the theodolite more to steady my posture than to sight. The shrubbery shivered, and there came again that exhalation, close now and edged with a smell of iron. We stood staring into the dark, the lamps guttering, and I realized we could neither account for what had been done to the dogs, nor trust our compass to find a safe line away. We made preparations to listen through the night, to note every breath and footfall the mountain laughed with wind, and something unseen shifted in the juniper, and the watch began. At first light, I saw a bulk on the ridge, a long-limbed, low-slung shape that moved with the silence of shadow. Its eyes caught the kerosene lantern and flashed a greenish glint, and the nearest hound uttered a single, cut-off cry. We had been up before dawn, folding damp greatcoats, stoking the little spirit stove, and laying out maps upon the plane table, while the theodolite still held its cold, vitreous stare. Our supplies were the usual: tins of corned beef and beans, a sack of hardtack, spare cartridges in leather pouches, a length of chain and a surveyor's tape, the aneroid barometer I had carried since the winter of 12, and enough kerosene for 3 nights' lantern light. The hounds, 2 of them in harness for pack and scent, had been nosing the edge of the camp, ears pricked against the grey. I remember the kerosene smell, the acrid tang of coffee, the small shiver of the men as they straightened into their jackets. Marek had one hand upon his Mannlicher Ivanko, who handled the dogs, had the other leash loose but ready. The fog lay low like wool, and under it the ridge took the shape of rocks and old firs. When the thing moved, we first took it for a fallen log, until the muscles in its shoulders drew like a tide under skin. Its gait was wrong. Too low, too long, each motion a flat, deliberate sweep. Yet it made no crack of twig or rustle of leaf. We fired. It was the reflex of men who have lived with wolves and the thought of brigands. 3 of us discharged volleys from our service rifles. The Mannlicher rounds bit the fog with sharp, metallic reports and spent cartridges scattered at our feet. The creature retreated into the mist without any visible injury. There was no tumble, no crimsons upon snow. Where it had passed, the snow and leaf litter were strangely undisturbed. No impression of paws, no compression of needles, as if some hand had scooped the earth and set it back in the same place. Ivanko cursed softly and moved toward the ridge with the theodolite slung at his shoulder, a ridiculous, impotent thing to carry in such company. We searched with the field glasses, sweeping the milky air. The trees offered only softened silhouettes. The ridge showed only an emptiness that the lantern's flame could not fill. The hound that had cried lay where it had been seconds before, its collar loose, the harness slack, but the dog itself was not there. I recall the smallness of that absence. No stain of blood, no broken twig, no shredded fur. Marek felt at the collar and found only a smudge of sap and the faintest drag of earth upon the leather. We checked the rifles, counted the cartridges. 6 rounds gone between the 3 of us, brass shells glinting in the low light. The barometer read lower than when we had retired. The air held water and an ache behind the eyes. We relit the lanterns, peered under boughs, and called the hound in the old whistling tone, short, bright, meant for foxes, and foxes alone. There was only the sound of our breath, the rasp of wool against wood, and the slow, patient fall of the fog. Arguments followed, quiet and edged. To pursue blindly into that milky veil with only the theodolite and 2 rifles was to court misfortune, but to remain and leave a companion, be he man or dog, was a cruelty we could not abide. We made quick, practical choices. Marek looped the spare rope about his belt. Ivanko took the remaining hound and fitted it with a bell. We left the plane table and the bulk of our food cached under a stone cairn, the theodolite secured beneath oilskin. The survey must be resumed. The maps could wait. We climbed. The thing's retreat had been slow. We followed the depression in the fog rather than any trace on the ground. Twice, I felt something brush the back of my hand like cool breath. And once, the bell on the hound's neck ceased to jingle altogether, as if a hand had closed upon it and stilled it between beats. Marek turned and met my eyes, his face hard and small with fatigue, and nodded. We traded the lamp between us, hands raw and trembling from the cold and from the quickening of something else, a professional insistence that tasks be completed in order, that bearings be taken and lines measured even as the world tilted toward a thing we had no name for. The ridge swallowed us with the fog. Behind, the camp lay as we had left it, lanterns guttered, the cache cold. Ahead, the mist moved like water and the air tightened. I kept my hand upon the rifle as if its weight might anchor me. The last thing I saw before the fog closed was the bell at the hound's neck. Frog orange paint dulled, the little metal loop turned, then silence and a presence at the edge of hearing that was not wind. We pressed on, instruments in our pockets, rations light, and a new question growing. What had taken a hound and left no trace? The answer did not come with dawn. We had been 3 days upon the ridge when the weather turned from thin sun to a steady grey vigilance. My notebooks record the ordinary, planetable and theodolite strapped in canvas, chain coiled in its leather case, pocket aneroid close to the breast, prisms in the leather of the surveyor's bag, tins of beef and biscuits, the kettle blackened from constant fire, a folding shovel, spare boots, a bolt-action rifle with a small belt of cartridges in a canvas roll. My men kept their habits, polishing lenses, rethreading seams, striking matches with the same economy that kept a small party alive, in a high place. The dogs were kept on leash by night. By habit, more than faith, we fastened them to the tent pegs. We were not careless. We withdrew with 2 hounds, 3 gone, not eaten in plain sight, but taken, dragged or led by an animal we could not classify. To us, it had been large, canid in aspect, yet moving like a shadow, and leaving none of the expected traces. I write that sentence as one might write of a missighting the men with me would not. They had been within a dozen paces when the sound rose, less a cry than the abrupt modification of wind through fur, and the lead hound, old Carol, slid from the leash as though the line had been cut. He did not run, he went. In the space of half a minute, 3 others followed, and the ridge received only their absence and the small scrabble of disturbed moss. We went at once, following the evidence of passage. There were tufts of dark guard hair caught upon twig and rock. The moss had been pressed flat in a blunt, continuous line, like a thumb pressed in clay. I expected spoor, claws, the scattering of bone. There was nothing of the sort. No claw gouges, no blood, no tearing of harness, no scat. Where a dog might have been dragged, the earth yielded a narrow furrow and little else. My men probed with the surveyor's chain and muttered curses. We fired a round into the air. The sound fell away, absorbed by damp and timber, as if the mountain took our report and put it to its own use. The lead man, Joseph, knelt and examined the hair. It was coarse and long, like the thick hair of a wolf, but darker and with a sliver of grey that glinted oddly under the lantern light. We collected samples in a cigar tin and wrapped them in oilcloth. The practiced question then, Tracks or no tracks, what had the map to do with such a thing? Our compass spun true. The altimeter behaved theodolite sights agreed with the bearing we took from the oak stump triangulation. Instruments told us where we were. They did not tell us what had passed. That night, the fire burned for 2 hours. The men would not sleep in the open. We shed tins of beef and cold coffee, hands rough and smelling of oil, the ordinary intimacy of a small human circle. Conversation turned from measured report to talismanic stories of ridge ghosts and forest wolves. None offered consolation save for a plan. At dawn, we would follow the line of the tufted hair down the lee of the slope into the old spruce. We would not be long. We were a survey party, not a hunting band our work compelled us to carry on. At dawn, we found the line broken. It led down to a small gully, then opened upon the fold of a ravine where the trees stood thick and the ground fell away into shadow. There were the marks of struggle in crushed juniper, a wedge of branches parted, and then nothing but the long, undisturbed blade of grass. I recall the smell then, not the iron of blood, but a faint, musky tang like a den. We traced until the sun raised enough to send the mist away, and when, finally, we admitted the limits of what we could do, the decision was made. We withdrew. Our written report joined many others in a desk drawer for wartime reasons, and thus the paperwork received the bureaucratic discretion of the months that followed. The village never forgot. My men refused further mountain work, and the ridge kept its silence as a reminder that something in the Carpathians had claimed our hounds and left questions that maps and instruments could not answer. The samples remain in a tin in my chest. I cannot say if the hair belonged to wolf or thing. The ridge is there still, and in certain weather, when the wind slants just so, I swear I can hear the faint rasp of fur upon stone, an argument the mountains do not deign to answer.